Services, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sarah Rawls. I'm Director of Alumni Career Services at the Alumni Association, and very pleased today to have with me Alicia Reese, who is a career coach who is passionate about sharing her expertise with the alumni community. So we consider her a friend of Emory, and she is also a career coach in Atlanta. So for those of you who are local in the city, you might see her giving presentations, and you might wish to contact her after the session, no matter where you live, to ask her some more questions over the phone. And I thank you for everyone for joining us today, especially under the conditions of Irma. I know many of you are from the southeastern region, so we hope you're all doing well. And just a reminder, if you do have to hop off for any reason today, we are recording the content. So afterwards, I will send you an email with Alicia's presentation materials, as well as a link to our Emory University YouTube channel, which has a career webinars playlist that houses over 70 past webinars that we've hosted on a variety of professional development subjects. So be sure to check that out. And I appreciate those of you who sent in questions in advance. Keep those coming because we will have plenty of time for Q&A today. So as you think of those questions, just type them into the question area on the GoToWebinar control panel. You can also submit any technical difficulties you're having to me there, and I can reach out to try and assist virtually. So before I turn it over to Alicia, I'm just going to tell you a bit more about her. As I said, Alicia Reese is a certified professional coach and senior consultant. She has over 16 years of global diverse experience in Fortune 500 organizations across high technology, manufacturing, and consumer goods industries. She spent nearly a decade with Cisco as a professional coach and in various HR leadership roles. So she has seen all types of managers, and that's why today we were passionate about addressing what it's like to be someone who works more on the inside, not with the forward-facing roles, and who might be a little bit more introverted and thus not as accustomed to talking about emotional intelligence. So that's how we discovered this topic today. And Alicia holds a master's degree in strategic leadership from the University of Memphis and a bachelor's from the University of Tennessee. She is a graduate of Coach U and has an associate certified coach certification from the International Coach Federation. And she is certified in emotional intelligence, DISC, Six Sigma, and Lean. So thank you so much, Alicia, for joining us today. I'll now turn it over to you.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Sarah. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, especially folks who may have had some impact as it relates to Hurricane Irma as well as Harvey. And so it's truly a pleasure to be here with you today to talk about one of my favorite topics, emotional intelligence. And Sarah shared with you just my brief bio. And typically when you hear bios, they share a lot of the highlights. And so you may not necessarily hear some of the challenges and struggles. And so just to be very transparent, earlier in my career, I did struggle. I struggled with limiting beliefs, negative self-talk, as well as a lack of confidence. And at the time, I really didn't have the language to categorize these struggles. But once I started doing the work, what I quickly realized is that a lot of these challenges were grounded in emotional intelligence. As such, over the last 15 plus years, I have done the work to harness my emotional intelligence. And then also I've made it my mission to support my clients in this space of cultivating their emotional intelligence in order to derive at the outcomes that they want personally as well as professionally. In terms of the objectives for today, really what I want to do is just lay the groundwork for emotional intelligence. What is emotional intelligence? Really helping you understand the importance of emotional intelligence, particularly as it relates to your career and your life. And then be able to share with you some real examples of people who have displayed low emotional intelligence as well as high emotional intelligence. And then obviously talk about some of the myths, because there's definitely a lot of myths that are associated with emotional intelligence. And you see on the slide EQ. So that's just an acronym for emotional intelligence. So you may hear me say EQ. So just know that those two are one of the same. I also want to share with you how emotional intelligence is currently leveraged across multiple organizations as well as industries. And then I think really the most important piece is so how do you take all of this information and really start to build your emotional intelligence. So I will share some tools as well as resources that can support you in building your EQ. So let's just start at the very high level. What is emotional intelligence? And I know oftentimes what comes to mind for a lot of people is that, it's a soft skill. It's not something that is based in science and so forth. And it doesn't necessarily supersede my IQ. And what I can tell you is that the way I define emotional intelligence is really a set of emotional and social skills that allow you to understand how you show up and be perceptive of how others show up in a way where you are able to make better decisions, manage relationships more effectively, as well as stress, in order to derive at the outcomes that you want in your career and in your life. And let's face it, everything in life is tied to emotions. Imagine yourself being in a car. Here in Atlanta, traffic is something that we are constantly battling. And so, some people may have a little road rage or, and things of that nature. And so, that's definitely impacting their emotional intelligence, as well as, in the work environment, dealing with bosses and employees, even dealing with your spouse and your children. Emotional intelligence is definitely very universal. The origins of emotional intelligence date back to the early 90s. With Peter Salovey and John D. Mayer, they actually coined the term emotional intelligence after doing a lot of research. And they noticed that emotional intelligence was truly powerful, and it could even be more powerful than your IQ. And there's been research to suggest that if you look at IQ and EQ, EQ really makes up about 80% of your success in life, whereas IQ is something that makes up about 20%. Definitely, as organizations look to hire employees, they are looking at emotional intelligence. They're not waiting for you to have it. They are actually wanting you to have that when you enter the organization. So much to the point where even though the World Economic Forum has stated that emotional intelligence is going to be one of the top 10 job skills of 2020. Now, I sit on the board for the Technology Association of Georgia's Workplace Learning Society, and oftentimes we will host chief learning officers, learning leaders around the state, just to really to seek their thought leadership on what's happening within organizations, the skill sets that they're looking for. And we recently hosted a panel discussion this spring, and it was a very universal thought that emotional intelligence is that key job skill. It wasn't about the technical. They felt like I can teach people some of the technical capabilities, but what's hard is to teach people how to better collaborate, better, get connected and better have, I guess, kind of this understanding of how they're showing up. So again, this is just an overview, very high level overview of emotional intelligence. And if we look at emotional intelligence, it actually can be broken down into 5 different dimensions. And so this is a model that I leverage. I have my certification through Multi-Health Systems. If you go out and Google emotional intelligence, there are certainly other models on the market. But I really like this particular model because I feel like it really breaks down emotional intelligence in bite-sized chunks. So starting at the very top with self-perception, it's really all about how we perceive ourselves. So really getting a handle on your own self-management in terms of how you perceive yourself from a self-regard perspective, which is really understanding what are your strengths, also what are your limitations, and being okay, right, with yourself and being confident still. Self-actualization is obviously all about being able to develop meaningful goals and actually pursue those goals to the betterment of your overall well-being. And emotional self-awareness, it's really about getting clear about what's going on in your head and the triggers of emotions that happen to not allow them to take over your being. And I would equate that to negative self-talk, limiting beliefs. And obviously on the other side of that coin, you have positive self-talk, right? And positive, affirmations and things of that nature. But having a handle on those different pieces obviously impacts how you express yourself outwardly. And that really delves into the next dimension of emotional intelligence, which is all about self-expression. And so if you think about self-expression, looking at, how you communicate with others in a way where you're able to build commitment, where you're able to build a level of consensus, and still be able to collaborate, but at the same time, there is a level of independence in your thinking, right, where you can hold your own even in the midst of dealing with emotional information. And I want to touch upon assertiveness, because I do think that there is definitely a fine line between being assertive and being aggressive. And oftentimes, depending on whatever is happening in our world, we can teeter over to the aggression. So it's just really important, again, for you to understand how you are expressing yourself. If you're able to express yourself effectively, then that obviously plays in your ability to build strong relationships, right? So the interpersonal dimension is all about relationship management, but relationship management from the standpoint of building relationships that are mutually beneficial. So you are obviously wanting to get something from the relationship, but you're able to give something in return. And I do think the empathy piece is important, and there's a lot of research on empathy, particularly as you rise in ranks as a leader, to really put yourself in the place of others as you are communicating, as you are really trying to move forward in your results. And if you have strong relationships, then you will be in a better position to make sound decisions. And obviously, in the midst of business today, there's constant change with the evolution of technology, which are basically shifting business models and so forth. And so being able to solve problems in the midst of having emotionally charging information and seeing things as they are through reality testing, but doing so in a way where you're able to stay cool, calm, and collect, and you're not being impulsive, will definitely play in your ability to derive at the results you want. And the last piece is all around stress management. So all of these different components certainly can, rise in your stress level, if you will, but being able to cope with challenges, having a level of flexibility in terms of how you deal with certain people, so not being so rigid and structured, but then also just being conscious if you are feeling stressed, being able to understand the triggers for the stress and being able to have coping mechanisms to support you. And then obviously, even in the midst of setbacks, still having a level of optimism is really important. So these are the key components, the 5 dimensions of emotional intelligence. What I would also say is that this model is shaped in the form of the wheel, and it's very intentional in the fact that these components, they work together, they work in concert to make up your overall emotional intelligence. And if you have balance in each of these areas, you'll notice that on the outside of the ring, and the gray shaded part of the ring, there's a sense of well-being, there's a sense of performance and development and so forth. So as we look at well-being, it's all around happiness. And let's face it, everybody in life, they want to be happy. They want to be happy in their careers, and they want to be happy in their personal lives. So now I want to just take a look at some various profiles of people who I've engaged with. I'm protecting the anonymity, so the names have definitely been changed, but I want you to look at really what does high emotional intelligence look like versus low emotional intelligence. So this is Alex. Alex is a leader within the organization, typically extremely introverted. He is in sales, but at the same time, he's having this meeting with his employees. It started out on a good foot, and then eventually something was said, and he became very emotionally charged. And instead of speaking assertively and holding his position, he went from a place of being assertive to very aggressive. And you notice in this picture that this is definitely impacting the engagement in the room. You have the lady on the right who's just kind of looking, looking with a blank stare. You have the gentleman on the left who's kind of looking down. And then the lady, we can't see her face with the bump in the back. She could be looking like, kind of a deer in the headlights. So we can only imagine, right? And so even though this team didn't necessarily make the sales quota, certainly this leader's behavior is not necessarily engaging or inspiring them to meet the sales quota. And so as a result, there could be implications as it relates to overall engagement, as well as performance. Nancy. Nancy is a client relationship manager. She is new to her role as of 2 years ago. Nancy's been doing well overall. At the same time, when Nancy shows up in meetings, there is a sense of limiting beliefs and negative self-talk. So the self-perception, going back to the will, is an area where she's really challenged. And so she's in front of all of her stakeholders, her managers in the meeting, and she's just allowing the self-talk to really drive her level of inaction from being participatory in the meeting. And as such, she starts to have, issues and challenges because they feel like, and when I say they, meaning the managers, feel like she's not necessarily as engaged. So that's Nancy. Let's look at James. James is a software engineer, very technically sound. In his world, he likes to really focus on, building areas within engineering. He likes to focus on doing things on his laptop, hence he has the spreadsheet open. He's been with his particular company for about 5 years now, and so he's ready for that next move. If you notice, there are other people in the office who are actually engaging and connecting, which obviously that typically happens within an office environment. You want to build strong relationships. James actually applies for a role within the company to be promoted, and he's actually declined. He doesn't get the job, and when he asks for feedback, he actually receives feedback that he's not really connecting with people well, right? Because he's so focused on the technical piece, he really has not taken the time to build strong relationships. And I always tell my clients this, results will get you noticed, but relationships will get you promoted. And obviously you need a combination of the two, but relationships are very critical. So we just looked at Alex, we looked at Nancy, as well as James. And so obviously having a lack of emotional intelligence has implications. And so not to say that these individuals would be fired, but certainly we saw that, there could be career limiting actions that could take place, performance, management type of challenges, including perhaps even being asked to tender a resignation. And so obviously, if there are things that are happening within the professional setting, it impacts how you show up with your spouse, with your partner, as well as with your children. And so again, I would just say that with emotional intelligence, very dynamic and very interconnected holistically with your career and your life. So there's one other profile that I want to look at, and that's Dana. So Dana is on the opposite end of the spectrum. Dana is new to her company. But she takes the time to actually build strong relationships. She has coffee. She takes the time to actually seek to understand before being understood. Hence, she's meeting with her colleagues here that you see. And as a result, she is happy. She's able to move her career forward, and she's also able to be listened to, right, and taken seriously in order to derive at the results. And so again, this is an example of someone who has worked to manage their own self-perception, self-expression, so all of those different dimensions of emotional intelligence that we just discussed. So now that we have a baseline understanding of emotional intelligence, and we've talked about the various pieces of the model, and we've gone through some different profiles of how EQ can show up in the work environment, I want to just take a few moments now to dispel some of the myths that are associated with emotional intelligence. And oftentimes when I am coaching clients, there are a lot of preconceived notions about emotional intelligence. The first piece is emotional intelligence is not your personality, right? And so when you think about your personality, it's really a representation of traits that forms your characteristics in terms of how you feel, think, believe, and really how you greet the world. And I know some of you may be familiar with the Myers-Briggs personality assessment. And what I would say is that if you were to take the assessment today and perhaps 2 to 3 years from now, more than likely your results would be very similar. Personality is typically fixed. So Honestly, I consider myself an introvert, right? And so that's, being around too many people after a certain while, I need to go and retreat and collect myself. And I've been like that since I was really a kid. So that's not going to change about, who I am. The other piece that I would say is aptitude, right? Oftentimes when we think about aptitude, it's really how you perform a particular technical skill or a discipline. And it's really connected to your IQ. And again, with your IQ, for the most part, it's similar to your personality. But when you think about emotional intelligence, it is a dynamic set of skills that actually grows over a certain time period. I know that there's some research that states that, your IQ typically starts to taper off when you're 17, like it's pretty much fixed. But with EQ, as you get older and you have more experiences, your emotional intelligence actually grows with the proper focus, as well as with the proper resources and tools, and of course support. So one other area that I think is connected to your IQ and aptitude, as you think about when leaders are promoted, typically they are promoted based upon their technical capability. So their aptitude, right? You've done really well in this individual contributor role. Now I'm going to throw you into a people leader role, right? Where you have a team and you're having to manage that team. And what I found in my experience, because again, a background in HR, and I've worked many years with a lot of new leaders and coaching them, is that what they are missing really involves a lot of the soft skills. So what I would love to do now, if you would just take a few moments to think about your favorite leader, and I'm sure everyone has a favorite leader who they have worked with and engaged with, and just start to list some of the attributes of those favorite leaders in chat, and then I'll ask Sarah if she could just start reading off some of the actual attributes that are shared by you all. So just take a few moments, and Sarah, as people start writing in chat, let me know.
All right, so far we have empathetic. Great one. All right, come on, everyone. I know we have some ideas floating out there. Transparent, open communication, proactivity, developing people, brave, organized, vulnerable, role model,
Mm-hmm.
clear expectations,
Okay.
clear-minded, and never losing their cool. All right, well, thank you. Those are really great. Thank you, everyone, for taking a moment to open up, and trusting and a good listener. Yep, the trust is key.
Yeah, trusting for sure. In all of those pieces, being empathetic, transparent, the open communication, being brave, the trusting piece, being clear-minded. I mean, if we were to go back to the model, we would be able to trace those different attributes back to emotional intelligence. So what I would say is, again, as you move higher in the organization, it becomes less about the technical and more about the EQ and being able to inspire, motivate, and engage employees. So with that, I just want to pause and see if there are any questions that are top of mind for you based upon what I've shared thus far. So feel free to put your questions in chat, and Sarah, you feel free to read those questions.
All right, I'll just give everyone a minute. All right, so no questions right now. So I think folks are, oh, okay, sorry, just two came in right away. So
Okay.
can lack of self-confidence lead to low emotional intelligence?
So can lack of self-confidence lead to low emotional intelligence?
Yep.
I would say
EQ.
absolutely. Low EQ, yes, absolutely. If we go back to the model, if you think about self-perception, and I'll just go back really quickly here so you can see it. Self-perception really is about your own ability to manage your own emotions, and that includes your self-regard. And so I would equate self-regard with confidence. And the way that I define self-regard is your ability to understand your strengths, but also your limitations, but still be confident to move forward in your, in your self-regard, right? You're still confident, you know that these are areas you need to work on. You're consciously and actively working on these areas, but you're able to still move forward. So certainly I do think that the low confidence plays into all of the other dimensions in terms of how you show up, not only with yourself, but with others and how people experience you.
All right. And our other question is about measuring your improvement with EQ. So someone here has been told to work on their EQ, and they've been going ahead and reading some recommended books and listening to webinars, but how do they actually measure themselves to test if this is working?
Yeah, so we're going to actually talk about that in just a moment, just in terms of how you can measure your emotional intelligence. And, assessment is definitely top of mind, but I don't want to steal the thunder. So let me talk through that in just a moment. And if you still have questions, certainly I'm happy to address them.
All right. Well, those are all the questions at this time. So looking forward to the next part.
Okay. All right. Sounds great. So the next stage is really just talking about how emotional intelligence is being leveraged in organizations. And what I would tell you is that emotional intelligence is very universal. It's industry agnostic, and it crosses, every industry. And so if you think about from the time you get up in the morning and greet the world with your family to, going out the door, heading into work, EQ is definitely at play, whether you're conscious of that or not. As organizations look at emotional intelligence, as I mentioned earlier, they're definitely leveraging it at different phases within their employee life cycle. So in terms of how they attract and recruit employees. And so looking at some organizations, Fortune 500 in particular, and I'll share some examples in just a moment, they look at EQ as a way of determining if this person is going to be a good fit with the team. But also even in academia, Pace University, Purdue University, Yale, they actually have embedded EQ as a part of their admissions process, particularly for the MBA program. So again, whether you're in higher ed or in corporations, EQ is certainly an area that's getting a lot of steam, particularly in recruitment. On the development side, once employees are nestled within their roles, they're definitely looking at EQ as a means to continue to grow a person, particularly as they move into leadership roles, as we talked about. The Center of Creative Leadership, which is an organization that is a consultant to many Fortune 500 organizations, they actually have listed the next generation leadership companies as self-awareness, learning agility, influence, and communications. And all of those areas are grounded in emotional intelligence. We can, again, go back to the wheel and point directly to where those different areas fall. But if you're able to develop strong employees, you're also able to engage them in a powerful way. And according to Gallup, over 50% of employees now are disengaged. So they're actively showing up to their jobs, but perhaps it's not a good fit, and they're just kind of going through the motions. And so emotionally intelligent employees, folks who are very clear about their strengths and very clear about what they want to do and being perceptive, again, of how they show up and being perceptive of others, are typically more engaged. And if you're more engaged, obviously you're going to really drive strong results from a performance perspective. And so what the research suggests is that 90% of top performers actually have high emotional intelligence. And that actually plays directly into the bottom line from a productivity and profitability perspective. So I just want to show you all just a few case studies of organizations that are actually leveraging emotional intelligence to drive bottom line results in productivity and profitability. And so looking at PepsiCo here on the left, again, they have leveraged emotional intelligence as a means of vetting their executives. So those executives who actually had higher emotional intelligence or EQ, they tend to be more productive, to the tune of about 10% more productive than those executives who displayed lower EQ. There was definitely less turnover because, again, they're very self-aware about, who they are and what they want to do, and they're engaged. And so, again, they're staying with their organizations. But as you can see, there's definitely value back to the organization to the tune of about $3.75 million. So, again, strong case there. And I know that there was a question submitted to Sarah earlier around dealing with emotional intelligence in the classroom. And so Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, they actually have a program, and it's a program that's based upon a lot of the early findings of Peter Salovey, who I mentioned earlier to you all as one of the forefathers of emotional intelligence. They have a program, it's called the Ruler EQ program. And basically they teach organizations or really schools across the globe on how to incorporate emotional intelligence practices in how they teach and how they connect with their students. And for those schools who have gone through the program, they've definitely experienced stronger classroom management. The performance of the kids have gone up, the attendance, confidence, and so forth. And so, for that individual who did inquire about classroom management and so forth, I would definitely recommend checking out the program. Very state of the art. And then the last piece here, just from a case study perspective, is AT&T. They have actually leveraged EQ assessments as a means to measure EQ for all of their levels of leadership, from the very first line leader all the way up through the executive level. And what they've realized is that the EQ has really contributed to those leaders being more productive and more effective leaders within their respective organizations. So again, I know that oftentimes people perceive EQ as being the soft skill, but there's definitely a lot of hard numbers that can enable organizations, again, to be very productive and profitable. So to me, this is the most important piece of the webinar, which is, so how do you start to develop your emotional intelligence, and what are some of the tools and resources that could support and anchor you in being able to drive your EQ? And I really do think first and foremost, it's around starting with yourself. So really having self-awareness. So I mentioned earlier to you all that Peter Salovey and John D. Mayer coined the term emotional intelligence in the 90s. Well, Daniel Goleman actually learned about the research and wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence, which was a New York Times bestseller. And, for all intents and purposes, he really put emotional intelligence on the map. And Daniel Goleman has said self-aware is the key to managing yourself. And if you think about being on a plane, right, before you can put the mask on someone else, from a safety perspective, you have to put the mask on yourself. So definitely start with your self-awareness. And if you start to build your self-awareness, the emotional intelligence assessment is a really good way of at least having a baseline understanding of where you fall on the scale as it relates to EQ. And so there are definitely many assessments out there on the market. However, I really, really love the Multi-Health Systems emotional intelligence assessment. It is actually the first scientifically validated assessment. It's reliable, valid. It's considered an Instrument B tool, which means that it's grounded in psychometrics and been tested and so forth. And it's really great. I mean, I've tested it with many clients, and they typically will say it's spot on. And what I also love about the assessment is there's an opportunity for you to take a self-assessment. But if you really want to have a clear 360 view, there is a 360 assessment where you can actually seek the input of other stakeholders and compare that to your own self-assessment to see if there are any gaps. And when I do facilitate the assessment, I always tell my clients is that even with your emotional intelligence, if it's low in a particular area or even high, it's really about fine-tuning these skills so that you can continue to get better and derive at the outcomes that you want in your career and in your life. Another way to develop your emotional intelligence is through a SWOT analysis. And for those business majors who have graduated with a business degree, you're probably familiar, I'm sure in some operations type of class, you received information around a SWOT analysis. The SWOT analysis traditionally is used to evaluate the health and vitality of an organization. But I've tweaked it a little bit in terms of the definitions to make it more of a personal analysis. So if you didn't want to take the assessment, you could start here with your personal SWOT analysis. And I'll just go through this analysis really quickly. The S stands for strengths. And so as you think about your strengths, these are the things that truly light you up and they energize you, okay? And so it's really about the energy you have when you are doing certain work or in certain areas of your life. And I know oftentimes, especially earlier in your career and you're still trying to figure things out, you will have people to tell you that you are so good at, budgeting, as an example. You are so good at, analysis and so forth. But it's really about how do you feel when you're actually doing that work? And that's the work you want to stay close to. For me, that's coaching. I love coaching. Doesn't matter if I'm having a bad day. Once I get on a call with someone or meet with them, I'm in a good place. And so that's definitely a strength for me. W is for weakness. So I know that people typically think of a weakness as a limitation. What I would ask you to do is just challenge your thinking a bit in that respect. And the way that I define weakness is really something that zaps your energy, right? Even if you are good at doing this particular task, right? So for me, while I love having my own business and I've had to budget for many, many years, and I'm pretty good at it, but it weakens me. When I open an Excel document, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to start to put together the budgets and so forth. So that to me, is an area that doesn't necessarily bring me energy. And I know with some clients, and you could be thinking, well, what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses? And I always say one area that you may want to consider as a resource is keeping an energy journal. So going through the day and really figuring out, okay, when I'm doing this particular activity, I feel like I have high energy, and when I'm doing this particular activity, I have low energy. The O stands for opportunities. And so opportunities are those things that drive your personal and professional growth. And so just thinking about where you are today and where you want to be, identifying that gap, and then start putting a plan in place to work toward, closing that gap. And I do think that the self-perception piece is very critical here, just in understanding, what would be meaningful for you that would allow you to be able to work in a place where you feel strong and you feel strengthened. The last area is around your threats. So threats are conditions within yourself that really get in the way of you being able to move forward. And oftentimes, when we look at threats, we think about, okay, what's going on outside of me, right? What's going on in my environment, with my spouse, with my kids, with my manager. But the way that I charge my clients with looking at threats is really the conditions within themselves, which includes limiting beliefs, negative self-talk, as well as a lack of confidence. And oftentimes these pieces are connected to fear. And one of the tools that I leverage for helping my clients to eliminate kind of the negative self-talk, and for the most part, I think a lot of people experience this, is the ABCDE model. And it's by Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis is a psychologist. He was very prominent in the 1950s, particularly around emotive behavior, which is really a very structured way of being able to navigate emotions as they happen within your life. And so A is all about identifying the activating event. So what's really causing you to have this negative self-talk? What are your beliefs around this self-talk? And then what are the consequences of you thinking in this way? And then D is really around what are the limiting the beliefs that you can begin to dispute. So just a really quick story with one of my clients. She really wanted to focus a lot on enhancing her networking capabilities, and there was some fear around her being able to do that successfully. And we actually went through this model to understand, the events, her current belief system, and the consequences. But then I quickly asked her to think about a time where she felt really connected to people, where she felt really powerful in building those connections. And she talked about a time where she actually had to prepare a talk in front of some senior partners. And, we talked about what she did to prepare for that talk. And she was able to actually use the energy around that experience, which was positive, including some of the actions, to get her to a place where she was able to transition the negative talk to more of a positive experience. And again, that's E. It actually changed her interpretation of the situation, and she was actually able to build a stronger network and go out and behave in that way. So those are just some of the tools and resources that, could be actual assessments, or even some tools that you can leverage on your own, right? Also, these are just some books. Again, I Googled emotional intelligence. I think this was earlier last week, and there were over 28 million results that came up. So there is definitely no shortage of information on this topic. These are some of the books that I think are great, and they actually cover various industries, from classroom management to being in corporate America, and even just, dealing with personal relationships. So again, these are some resources that you can take a look at. So in summary, I would say that emotional intelligence is definitely a game changer, and it's definitely something that you can build over time. A year ago, just another quick story, a year ago, I actually started running with the group. Now, I've always been a fitness fanatic, doing a lot of cardio and weights and so forth, but I never really considered myself a runner. And so the first time I went out running, I could barely keep up with the group. In fact, I had to stop to walk. But subsequent runs, I certainly started to get better and better. And so now I'm actually up to about 6 miles that I can run in about an hour. And so I would just say, I tell you that story because I think it's important for you to understand, with emotional intelligence, you may not necessarily have the highest at this point, but similar to that run, you can build your endurance, you can build your muscle in this space with the right intention, with being self-aware, as well as with the right resources. So I always like to end my sessions with a positive quote or affirmation. And these Aristotle quotes were just so poignant, and they really stuck out. I felt like they were very appropriate for this session. So the first one is, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. And I do think that the key to emotional intelligence and the key to really true wisdom is having self-awareness and being able to self-manage. And then in terms of educating the heart, educating the mind without educating the heart, it really is that balance between IQ and EQ, right? And you really have to have both in order to be successful in your career and in your life. So it has been my pleasure sharing this information with you. I know that we're going to pause now for some questions, but I just wanted to share my information with you. Social media, I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, as well as Instagram. Feel free to visit my website. I would love to stay connected. So I'll turn it back over to you, Sarah.
All right. Thank you so much for this great information, Alicia. I know everyone has a lot of work to do now to reflect on their own EQ and look at that SWOT analysis, which I really love. So please take a moment and type in any questions you might have for Alicia. I'm going to start with some of the ones that were submitted in advance. So for someone, and this is really what you touched on throughout the whole presentation, but anything to add for those who consider themselves to be more thinkers than feelers and can't use those feeling or intuitive emotions to read a room or another individual when they're in conversation? What are some tools they can turn on?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that the thinker and feeler piece, you have to have both when you're dealing with emotional intelligence, right? Because the emotion is more of the feeling part, but the thinking is really the intelligence. So I really think that being mindful of the dimensions that we talked about, and just being really mindful of how you are showing up in a room, right? Are you showing up the way that you want? And being perceptive of others means that you're able to understand how they're showing up. So look at their body language. What are they saying? What type of tone are they leveraging? And you being able to mirror back and have a more positive and engaging connection with that person. And if you think about communication, I think it's like 70% tone and body language versus actual words. So I definitely would look at the cues when connecting with people in order to derive at the result that you want. And also really be mindful of your own triggers, right? So that you can self-manage accordingly.
Okay, great. And what happens when you are the person who needs to give feedback to someone else about their emotional intelligence? How do you go about that conversation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? So I feel like it really depends, right? It's relative. So if you're in a situation where you have to give emotional intelligence feedback to a subordinate and you're the manager, I think that that's an easier conversation to navigate. But if you're in a situation where you're having to give feedback to a peer, for example, I think you need to really understand the dynamics of the relationship that you have with that person. So really, if we go back to that wheel, like the interpersonal piece will be very critical. So really check yourself to understand, okay, well, what relationship do I have with this person? Also look within yourself, right, to see if there are things that you could be doing differently to connect with this person. And if you have a good relationship, especially if it's a peer, yeah, I think it's about pulling them aside, certainly starting with something positive because you don't want to break their spirit. You want to keep their esteem high. But then also just inserting, I've noticed this. What are your thoughts? Like leave it very open-ended about what you have experienced with them. But again, the precursor is having that relationship, because if you don't have the relationship, that could turn in a different direction than what you had envisioned.
All right. And how should I best manage my triggers and biases?
Yeah, so triggers and biases. That's, it's those things are very much embedded in all of us, right? We all have triggers, we all have biases. I can just kind of use a story. I was working with a client who was a go-getter, still is a go-getter, very smart technically. However, when she engaged with her peers and subordinates, she was very emotionally charged. And so there was really no filter, around the self-awareness, and hence, I come in as the coach to help her really understand those triggers. So I think first and foremost, it's about understanding your triggers and really taking note of them. And even if you're in a situation where you're unaware of the triggers, again, I think having a journal and really being able to kind of step outside of yourself, which I know sounds kind of weird, but step outside of yourself to look at how you're behaving based upon certain situations. And you'd be amazed to know that so many people are walking around just with not a filter, right? And with not a clear understanding of their triggers. And so I think depending on your trigger, you can put together some mechanisms, right, to support you if you are feeling emotionally charged. So in the instance of that client example I gave you, she knew that when she received pushback in certain forums that she would get emotionally charged to the point where she would either cry or have an aggressive type of outburst. So we talked about draining the emotion, but first and foremost, if you know that that's a trigger for you, step away from the conversation, step away from the building, go out, grab coffee, do something that's going to make you feel better in that moment. And then once you're cool, calm, and collected, then you go and respond. And I always say that when people don't manage their triggers, they end up reacting versus responding. And that's how you have the demise of relationships and results. And it's kind of a ripple effect.
All right, wonderful. And what resources do you think we should all go and check out after this, or maybe encourage our colleagues or direct reports to read as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely think Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence, it was very groundbreaking in terms of the research that he put forward, and that really set the tone for emotional intelligence to become this universal skill set across, multiple organizations and industries. So that book is actually referenced on the resources slide that I shared. I think the other piece is focusing on yourself, right? So self-awareness is really the key. So just being mindful of your triggers and how you show up based upon those triggers. Keeping a journal, I think, is helpful as well, so that you can constantly be mindful, again, of how you're showing up and really challenging yourself. Is this how you want to be perceived, right? Because I think oftentimes in our minds, we feel like we're showing up a certain way, but then in actuality, when it's time to get promoted or it's time to do something different, the perception may be different. So even testing the perception of how you want to be shown up or how you want to show up and be viewed in an organization, I think is important. Even just checking in with family members, friends, trusted confidants in the work environment, people who you feel safe with, right? Who will be able to share some real feedback with you, but being open and receptive of the feedback. I think that's definitely important.
Okay, and I feel like each of us probably has at least one coworker who does not have a high EQ, but they are really talented in their work, and so they're able to they were able to move to a leadership role, and people essentially let their low EQ slide because they have the talent. What do you recommend for us in working with that individual and maybe trying to navigate that relationship, or suggest some increased emotional intelligence work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely think with peers, it's tough, right? Because they're not accountable to you, right? They're just not. And so again, I think it goes back to the relationship. How strong is the relationship for you to be able to share feedback? But I think more importantly, it's about looking at yourself and understanding how are you showing up in that relationship. Are there certain triggers that happen when you're dealing with that person? If that person is not demonstrating a high level of emotional intelligence, is that in turn changing how you show up, right? And maybe as a result, you start to, get mad or aggressive and so forth, and your EQ starts to diminish. So I would recommend, again, a couple of things: understanding the strength of the relationship, to see if you could have that conversation, right? And only you would know that. But again, really looking at yourself, and if you feel like you show up differently with this person, then you need to understand, the triggers and how to cope with those triggers in order to deal with this person. And I do believe there are people out there in every organization, right, that has low EQ, and they're talented, but you still have to deal with them. And it's really about you at that point. So.
Okay. All right. And we did have an interesting question. I think I know the answer, but just to address it for this person, if you are a very sensitive person or individual, do you feel that you can still strengthen your emotional intelligence, or will you have a more difficult time doing so?
Absolutely. I definitely think you can strengthen your emotional intelligence. Again, it starts with self-awareness. So kudos to that person who acknowledges that they're very sensitive. Now it's about figuring out what's a plan that would support you in being able to cultivate your self-regard, right? Which kind of gets to the confidence and so forth. And to really have, you know, a tougher skin, if you will. So I do think that, we'd have to understand exactly what are some of those sensitivities, which could be connected to your triggers, in order to wrap a plan around that to support you in being able to demonstrate stronger EQ. But, high level, absolutely, you can still develop your emotional intelligence.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Alicia, and everyone else. Best of luck to you as you go forth and become more emotionally intelligent. I hope you will reach out to us with questions afterwards, and please submit your feedback in a survey I will be sending. We also have past presentations that are on related subjects, so I will be sending those to you as well. Alicia, we will be following up with you, and thanks again for your time. And just a question
Absolutely.
that just came in about receiving the slides. Alicia, we'll get those out tomorrow. Does that work for you?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.